Yes. Good morning, friends, and welcome to this meeting of Baroda Book Browsers again on web platform. Today's book is Putin's People: How the KGB Took Back Russia and then took on the West. This is a book written by a journalist, Catherine Belton, who was in Russia, in Moscow, as a correspondent of Financial Times for 6, 7 years, has lived there, has traveled across Russia, and therefore she is giving a very good inside perspective of what all has happened in Russia after the fall of Soviet Union, and more precisely, after 1998, when Putin has effectively been, charged the affairs of the chieftain of Russia for now almost 2 decades. Be that as it may, let me also talk a bit about the Soviet Union in the 20th century and the Russia or Russian Federation as it is now. But before I do that, why not I take an opportunity to introduce today's book reviewer. He is Vikram Singhal. Many of you know him because he is one of the frequenters at Baroda Book Browsers meetings for the last 10 years. He has reviewed 3 books earlier. The last one that I remember was Super Intelligence, and then I think he reviewed one book on the elephant, the inequality aspect. These 2 books I remember. The third one, which he reviewed 10 years back, I am not able to recollect, but he has reviewed 3 books, and this is the 4th book he's reviewed. Vikram is a very successful young CEO of a multinational company of USA, but based in India for its India and Southeast Asia operations. He's very successful, and his work is well acclaimed in the professional and business circles. But besides that, he is an avid reader. He is also an avid golfer, and he takes a lot of interest in anything and everything connected with tangible and intangible aspects of heritage. But most interestingly, if you have observed, the biodata, the 3-line biodata that I circulated, which I received from him, there is a word called intrepid. Intrepid is a very appropriate word. He's an intrepid traveler. What does intrepid mean? Intrepid means somebody who is fearless, somebody who shows a lot of resoluteness, somebody who has a lot of fortitude to undergo the necessary rigors, and endurance of an adventure travel. What it means is that he loves adventure travel. So that's the intrepid traveler and today's reviewer, Vikram. But before I say adieu and hand it over to him, let me give a little bit of background of Soviet Union. Uh, Soviet Union, as it existed before 1990, when its collapse occurred, was the advent or the outcome of a bloody revolution which took place in 1917, continued for 3, 4 years, to upstage the monarchy then prevailing, or that was the political order of Russia, Soviet Union, and then it became a Soviet Union and adopted communism as a political order. And for good 70 years, Soviet Union was the leading light and the torchbearer of communism as a political order in different parts of the world. At the zenith, probably sometime in 60s, the communism led and largely influenced by Soviet Union covered almost 40% of humanity in number, if you include also China in that. So that was the Soviet Union. It was the only alternate superpower throughout post Second World War era right up to 1990 when it collapsed. And it collapsed as a result of the lot of economic and social unrests that took place in 80s, as a result of which Mikhail Gorbachev, who became General Secretary in 1985, he decided to go for restructuring and liberalization. Very popularly, those were the very buzzwords in 90s and 2000, the glasnost and perestroika. But that glasnost and perestroika, when Soviet Union ultimately collapsed and this Russian Federation, a lot of other countries went out of the erstwhile Soviet Union, and Russia itself as a large chunk became somewhat a managed democracy. It saw a lot in the adjustment and stabilize. Suddenly from communism, you are transformed to, liberalized sort of economy. To give you an idea, in 1991, Soviet Union had some 45,000 enterprises, business enterprises and commercial enterprises, which were absolutely under the control of the government. Now, all of them were liberalized, and a lot of looting and plundering took place, and oligarchy took place. Now, there is one aspect I want to say, that this book is written from a Western perspective. And as you all know, Vladimir Putin is not exactly the favorite boy of the Western world. But let me tell you, a lot of looting and a lot of plundering and a lot of kleptocracy was existing in Russia before Putin came to power. And I personally feel, this is my personal view, that but for Putin's entry and taking the center stage of Russia, probably Russia would have seen further disintegration. But that's my view, which is very a contrarian view to what has been expressed in the book, because the book talks more about, the KGB and the intrigues of Putin in, maintaining the power and so on and so forth. So anyway, that's the perspective which I thought I will share with you. Without further ado, over to you, Vikram, and let's hear him out. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Sunil. And thanks for that wonderful introduction. I think you made my job very easy. You always do that for any reviewer because you set the context very well. Thanks for doing that. And I just want to make one correction. This is my fourth book. I've already done 4 books. You forgot the book about the Silicon Valley that I did about a few months, about a year back. So anyway, so this is
sorry. I stand corrected. Yeah, thank you.
This is my 5th book, so that's okay. But the first time on this platform, and I think we were talking about any jitters. So I said no. Working over the online platform over the last 5-6 months feels like doing the normal thing. So it's the new normal as we talk about. And I hope that the face-to-face interaction that we used to have in the BBB, that will not be there. I'll miss that. But obviously through the chat, we'll try to ensure that there's enough interaction. So I'll try to take about 30 minutes to 40 minutes about the book. It's a complex book. It's not easy to do a review of this book because every single page of this book is about 700 pages long. And every single page has got so many facts and information that it's physically impossible to put that across and help people understand what the context of the book is. But I'll try to do my best in terms of give you a synopsis, give you a understanding of the key essence from the book and what I have gleaned out personally. See, as a person who grew up reading a lot of books since late 70s and throughout 80s, and I grew up in Calcutta, a lot of the books that I read were Soviet literature, being Calcutta, being, under the communist influence, a lot of those communist authors and books were easily available. So I grew up a lot of reading all these Soviet books. But after 1989 and 90, after the Perestroika and the fall of the Berlin Wall and the change of guard, Yeltsin, and then the oligarchs, and then Putin came in, and then all these changes that have happened in the Soviet Union and the breakaway of the republics on the Eastern Europe side and then in the Central Asian side. It's really added to my curiosity. And then last year I visited Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, two erstwhile republics of Soviet Union, and that also added to a lot. So when I saw this book is published in May this year, and when I saw this book, I said I must read this book because as even though as Sunil mentions that this book has got a Western perspective, obviously yes. Catherine Belton, she worked in Moscow for Financial Times from 2000 to 2013 as the correspondent. And then in 2016, she was the legal correspondent of the newspaper, again for Russia. And she has also reported for Moscow Times in the interim and Business Week on again Russia. So she has spent a huge amount of time on Russia. I would say more than 15 years on Russia, and she's currently living in London and working as the investigative reporter for Reuters. And she was also shortlisted for the Business Journalist of the Year in British press. And in this book, um, Catherine Belton has done a great job, I would say. Even though her perspective, whatever she has put in, might seem as a Western perspective. And she has tried to put together a coherent account of how KGB and Putin have been able to infiltrate the highest echelons of British, European, and US politics and create vast financial networks to help them deepen their influence and further Russia's interest. So I think this is the sum, this is the whole essence of the book that what Catherine has tried to do. Again, I would like to clarify that this book is not a biography of Putin, not at all. It does not go into Putin's personal life in as much details. But this is a portrait of this generation of security agents in Russia. And Putin was a part of KGB. So it is a story, it's an account of how this set of security agents took center stage and took control of the Russian country, economy, politics, ideology, and everything. This book is essentially an account of money and power in the Kremlin based on a series of interviews that the author has conducted over the past several years. Many of these interviews that she has conducted, she has been able to reveal the names of the accounts, of the people, whom she has been talking to. But then there are several interviews in which she has not been able to divulge the names. So sometimes you get frustrated. Okay, how can I trust it if there is no name associated with what she's talking about? But that is the essence of the Russian, if you talk about Putin, then definitely people are not going to be comfortable because as you are aware that Russians who have talked about negatively, they have met with very dire situations. And the latest in the news is Mr. Navalny, who has been poisoned, who is a vocal critic of, and then there is accounts of Litvenko, who was murdered with a polonium poisoning, and then various accounts of people being poisoned in various parts of UK and Europe. So there is a lot of, and sometimes I think that's where you might try to question, but again, you have to understand the context with which the author is presenting the information. And again, one more trivia that I picked up as I was researching on the author and about the book. In the years that it took Catherine Belton to research and write this book, Putin's People, a number of her interview subjects tried various tactics to undermine her work. Because when she reached out to people to talk to them, and Catherine has done a great job of speaking not only to Putin's detractors, but also people who are on Putin's side. So she has tried to bridge the gap, so as to get the information from both angles. And Putin's close ally, again, she doesn't name him, was very alarmed by the questions, and especially the questions that she was asking about Putin's role during the Berlin Wall fall in 1989 when he was appointed as a KGB agent in Dresden, a city in East Germany. And his quote is, you should not ask any questions about that and the terrorist organizations in those times that KGB had links with, and you should not try to do so, he warned her. Another source, defending Putin's tenure as the deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, took a cooler approach. He asked about a local politician named Marina Saily, who had found evidence of corruption during Putin's time in St. Petersburg on a scheme that he was running called as Oil for Food. And he said that he just rejected her findings. He didn't reject her findings. She said this all happened. This is absolutely normal trading operations. And then to add insult to injury, he tells her, how can you explain this to a menopausal woman like you? So it was very personal attack on her as she writes the book. However, this is what the book is all about. Belton brings out the kind of two-pronged strategy that Kremlin has used to pursue its interest at home and abroad, not only during Putin's regime, but also prior to that. It deploys threats, disinformation, and violence to prevent damaging secrets from getting out, or resort to a chilling cynicism that derides everything as meaningless anyway. Dauntless, but Catherine is a very, the way she has gone through finding out the information is very, very commendable. She has talked to people with disparate interests who are directly involved, indirectly involved on all sides. And she has done a great job of tracking out the documents. And at the end of the day, what matters most, following the money trail. She has tried to establish how the money flowed through the system, because at the end of the day, that is the proof of the pudding, how the money has flowed and who has got what money. And she has done an excellent job of trying to document this whole process. The result is a very meticulously assembled portrait of Putin's circle and the emergence of what she calls KGB capitalism. That's the word that she uses. A form of ruthless wealth accumulation designed to serve the interest of a Russian state, relentless in its reach. So this is, again, this book is very tedious in terms of doing a review, and so I'll be reading out a lot of passages from the books, because Belton has very, very beautifully written down sentences which bring out the essence of what she's trying to convey. So bear with me. Some of the passages that I'll be reading out might sound a little bookish, but hopefully that will give you the essence. So to start off, the book is basically about 500 pages of reading, and it has got about 150 pages plus of data that you can go through, information, supporting information, epilogues, prologues. So there's a lot of additional information to show what is the source of that information. So again, a very meticulously researched and put together book. The book is divided into 3 parts. Part 1 is about Putin's deployment as a KGB agent in Dresden, East Germany, during the fall of Berlin, during the Berlin Wall fall. Then, during that time, as the wall was falling and the Soviet Union was breaking up, how KGB did planning with terrorist organizations for disruption in West Germany. Then it talks about Putin's subsequent relocation to St. Petersburg as a close associate of its mayor, Sobchak, and the masterminding of the slush fund called as Oil for Food program, with help from local mafia. And then subsequently his move to Moscow as a lowly Kremlin administrative employee during the Yeltsin rule, rising quickly to become the reluctant president-elect with help from Yeltsin family insiders. So that's the first part of the book. It's pretty long, very detailed, goes into huge amount of lot of interviews and putting a lot of data together. Part 2 talks about Putin's early days as the president, the Chechnya war, the relentless control of Russian energy resources and takeover of key enterprises by Putin's coteries, influence in the Ukrainian Orange Revolution in 2004, if you guys remember, the Georgia incursion that Russia did around the same time, the dismantling of the Yeltsin era oligarchs like Khodorkovsky, the growth of KGB, or now in its new name FSB, the growth of their tentacles in the Eastern Europe, France, Germany, and UK, through huge swathes of money being laundered into the West via multiple shell companies. Well-placed KGB men and the gradual rise of Russian imperialistic ideology with help of the Russian Orthodox Church and the anointment of Putin as the new Tsar of Russia. So, so this is actually, you will see this portion show how Russia is going back to its pre-Bolshevik days, to the times of the Tsars, and how Putin has developed his thought process and his thinking to match and in alignment with the thinking of the imperialistic thinking before the Bolsheviks took over in 1918. Part 3 of the book, which is the culmination portion of the book, covers the further consolidation of Putin's control of the natural gas resources through Gazprom, if you remember this company, and using that as a key tool in its bargain with Ukraine and European Union. If you remember these, the power gas to Ukraine was shut down, gas to Eastern Europe was shut down in mid 2000s when there were differences and then led to Ukrainian war. Then the return of Putin as a president in 2012 after a brief hiatus of 4 years, annexation of Crimea, that is Ukraine, portion of Ukraine, support to Syria, the growing influence of Russia in US politics via Donald Trump, encouraging Brexit, and promoting right-wing and far-left politicians in the European Union, and the general derision of the liberal Western values and ideals, and the relentless effort to undermine it through corruption and propaganda. So, so the book finishes with, the 2020. The last reference to this book is in spring 2020, March 2020. So that book it's a very recent book and covers right from, I would say, 1989 till 2020. The book does not cover, according to me, certain important aspects of Putin's governance. It was the Sochi Olympics and the doping scandal that erupted out of there, and then subsequently led to the disqualification of huge numbers of Russian athletes, and how that doping program was run by Putin. I think she could have covered that. She did not do that. Belton has not talked about Russia's ties with China. She has not touched upon that at all with India. So I think she could have talked a little bit about that in the book also. But nevertheless, I think the book, as I mentioned and Sunil mentioned earlier, it's more from a Western perspective. Influence of Russia on Europe and America. That's what primarily the book is all about. So now, let me try to give you some key elements and excerpts from the book that will hopefully provide you with some insight as to why and how Putin and the KGB have been able to reassert and grow themselves into what they are today after the disintegration of Soviet Union in 1989. So I'll read out a few paragraphs that will give you a good sense, because I thought the paragraphs themselves were very well written. It was December 1989. The Berlin Wall had fallen, and in Dresden, crowds were gathering outside the headquarters of Stasi, the East German secret police, shouting insults and demanding access. Nearby, frantic KGB officers, The Soviet advisors, whom the Stasi had long referred to as the friends, were barricaded inside their villa, burning papers. We destroyed everything, remembered one of those KGB officers, Vladimir Putin. All our communications, our list of contacts, and our agents' networks. We burned so much stuff that the furnace burst. These are actual Putin's words, by the way. Towards evening, a group of protesters broke away from the Stasi building and started marching towards the KGB villa. Panicked, Putin called the Soviet military command in Dresden and asked for reinforcements. None were forthcoming. I got the feeling then that the country no longer existed, that it had disappeared. Putin told an interviewer years later. It was clear the Union was ailing and it had a terminal disease without a cure, a paralysis of power. The shock was total and he never forgot it. These are seminal. This is, I think, one of the most important seminal sentences in the book because it describes what happens later on and helps us understand why we are where we are today in Russia. For hundreds of millions of people, the fall of the Berlin Wall was a great triumph. The moment marked the end of hated dictatorships and the beginning of a better era. But for the KGB officers stationed in Dresden, the political revolutions of 1989 marked the end of their empire and the beginning of an era of humiliation. In interviews, Putin has returned to that moment, the moment when reinforcements did not come, always describing it as a turning point in his own life. Putin swore, it seems, to dedicate his life to restoring his country's glory. However, many in the KGB were not shocked by the events of 1989. And so this was very good revelation that the author brings about. Many of the KGB leaders have been preparing early, preparing for this kind of a fall, and some of these KGB people had actually helped create the situation for perestroika. If you read the book and the interview she conducts, you will get a sense that a lot of these KGB officers were convinced that communism will not survive. It will not help Russia go forward. And they were all for creating a capitalism-based economy in Russia. And they, in fact, were enablers for the perestroika and the glasnost that Gorbachev brought in. So they were also planning to do some kind of disruption. So in August 1988, so they were planning ahead of time. In August 1988, a high-ranking official from Moscow arrived in East Berlin and began recruiting German sleeper agents who continued to work with the KGB, or rather the institution that replaced the KGB, that is FSB, even after the reunification of Germany and the fall of Soviet Union itself. At about the same time, the KGB was also setting up the offshore accounts, fake businesses, and hidden black cash funds that would, in the 1990s, propel some of its members to great wealth and power. From 1986 to 1988, for example, the Stasi transferred millions of marks to a network of companies in Switzerland, Liechtenstein, and Singapore, all run by an Austrian businessman named Martin Schlaff. He and his companies would re-emerge years later as central cogs in the influence operations of the Putin regime. So the KGB has been preparing and creating these networks from the before in anticipation of the breakdown of communism and preparing the world where the KGB agents will not be helpless. So this was a very good revealing aspect of how KGB was planning for this transition. The KGB and Stasi also organized meetings in Dresden with some of the extremist organizations they supported in the West and around the world. One former member of Red Army faction, the West German terrorist organization called as Bader Meinhof, if you remember, told Belton. So she actually met with this person. Again, the name of this person is not revealed. So again, you don't know how far it is true. That one of its most notorious final actions was planned with the help of KGB and Stasi in Dresden. In late November 1989, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, Alfred Herrhausen, the chairman of Deutsche Bank, a close advisor to the German government on the economics of reunification and proponent of a more integrated European economy, was killed by a car bomb. So, and it seemed that the KGB had planned it, as per the source who tells this to Belton. Now, during this, while Putin's personal involvement in any of these projects, as the Russian leader has gone, according to her and her sources, the Russian leader has gone to great lengths to conceal his real role during the 4.5 years he spent in Dresden. But throughout her book, she adds enough new details to establish beyond doubt that the future Russian president was working alongside the people who set up the secret bank accounts and held meetings with the subversives and the terrorists. More important, she establishes how years later these kinds of projects came to benefit Putin and shape his worldview. So you will see a lot of us throughout the book, a lot of references going back to these networks created during these East Berlin, Dresden times in 1989 or pre 1989 that were uh, call to action and that helped the Putin and his KGB cronies to activate a lot of the money laundering and propaganda work that they have been doing in the world after that. So that's her assertion based on the linkages that she shows. Um, uh, Sorry, just 1 second. Yeah. The KGB made extensive use of slush funds and front companies to fund Western communist parties. Belton suggests that Putin employs a similar money laundering model in the 1990s. Now, after Dresden, Putin decides to go back to USSR, and he decides to go back to Leningrad at that time, which then subsequently becomes St. Petersburg, because that's where he grew up. And he got a job with the St. Petersburg mayor, Anatoly Sobchak. Putin worked hand in glove with the organized criminals who controlled the city's port and oil refinery. She describes the famous swindle he ran in St. Petersburg, selling oil abroad on the city's behalf, supposedly to buy food for its inhabitants. The profits from this scheme went on to create a hard currency slush fund known in Russian criminal slang as an obshchak, much of which financed other operations and eventually enriched Putin and his friends. Now, this oil for food fund was basically, as after the Berlin fall and disintegration of communism, there were a lot of shortfall, and food shortfall was a big issue in Soviet Union. And so this was, and Soviet Union did have oil. So they used to export oil, they would get food, but the differential was all transferred to secret slush funds, that and money was sent abroad through these front companies that were sold. So again, I'm just giving you a synopsis, but Belton paints out how exactly this work's done through multiple companies and interviews of people who were part of those operations, and with multiple mafia bosses. The mafia bosses who controlled because the St. Petersburg was the oil terminal through which all the oil out of Russia was moving out. So it was the most important port to control. And whoever controlled the port would control the money. And that's how the mafia, the mob, the Russian mob that controlled it, and the KGB were working together to control this money. So that's the work that Putin did in the early 90s as the country was converting from communism to democracy. Um, and again, Belton does a good job of trying to establish that this was not Putin's idea. He was not doing all this. He was just a part of a cog in the entire KGB machinery. The people who facilitated Putin's rise did not do so for a particularly idealistic reason. And ailing Boris Yeltsin and the oligarchs who thrived in the chaos after the collapse of the Soviet Union were looking for someone who would preserve their wealth and protect them from corruption charges. So what was happening was, I will not go too into detail because that's about 9 years, and the book devotes multiple pages on the Bolshin era regime and how Yeltsin um, helps the oligarchs to really come up. How Russia was bankrupt during the reign of Boris Yeltsin, and for the country to keep on operating, Yeltsin had to sell publicly, private, the government-owned companies, especially the energy companies, railways, etc., etc. And what happened was, at that time, Yeltsin's close family circle, friends, and also support from KGB. By the way, KGB also supported Yeltsin in developing these oligarchs. And so the oligarchs rise during the time of Yeltsin, which I think that's what Sunil was talking about, that all the plundering that was taking place, and that really happened. Companies worth billions of dollars were bought by these oligarchs for $100 million, $300 million, and the value of these companies was in multiple billions of dollars. And so the Russian exchequer, the Russian public were really fleeced during the Boris Yeltsin time. And this was the seminal situation. And when Yeltsin was fell ill, and he was not able to run the country, the oligarchs and the Yeltsin family, they needed somebody who could protect them, who could protect their wealth, who could, and also avoid them being prosecuted from corruption, because the Yeltsin family and the oligarchs were deep in corruption. They had just ripped apart the Russian economy for their own benefit. So at that time, what happened was that Putin had moved on from St. Petersburg, because after the oil for food scandal happened, the scandal actually broke out, and Putin decided that he should go away from St. Petersburg to distance himself from the scandal. And he came to Moscow, and he was given a job. Now, again, in Kremlin, in the administration. Again, there is a question mark. I think Belton tries to prove, but she's not able to prove that KGB planted Putin in Moscow, in Kremlin, into the Yeltsin family. So that is an assertion she makes. However, I don't think that she has been able to prove it, but that's her hypothesis based on the multiple interviews that she does. And as Putin goes in over there, he climbs the ladders, and then the Yeltsin family, at the end of around 1999, they needed somebody who could succeed Yeltsin. But at the same time, they wanted somebody who would be able to protect them. And one of the oligarchs, Pugachev, he noted Putin, and he said that this guy is very efficient. He does his job well, and he's very silent. Putin was very silent. He was not a very vocal person. He used to do his job and keep a low profile. And they thought that he would be the right person to whom we can give the presidency and whom we can control. So that was the whole idea behind Boris Yeltsin and his family selecting Putin as somebody to succeed Yeltsin as the president. And Putin also presented himself as someone who would honor the bargain. And but once he took power, he eliminated them from the game, arresting some throughout the early 2000s and chasing others out of the country. Uh, Now, again, the book talks about how, at the same time that Putin was negotiating with the Yeltsin family and the oligarchs, he was also meeting the KGB senior leaders. So, again, she has not been able to prove what was the discussion and whether a conspiracy was hatched, but she did mention some facts about Putin working on both sides. Um, and But the truth is that the oligarchs and Yeltsin agreed to put Putin in. Putin agreed to save them and not to initiate any action against them. So when Putin became president on 31st December 1999, he was anointed as the president. He made sure that some of Yeltsin's family members and his close friends and the oligarchs were part of the administration. Like the prime minister was a Yeltsin close ally. So there were a lot of elements that were put together so that the family of Yeltsin is not touched. Uh, However, the KGB has its own plan, according to Belton. And in a bid to strengthen Putin's position as the leader of Russia, KGB generals are suspected to have staged Chechnya. At that time, the Chechen war was also going on because they wanted to break away. And it is, again, through various interviews and data, she has shown that there is this specter that I don't know if any of you remember, but there was a Moscow apartment bombing by the Chechen terrorists. Then there was a the Bolshoi theater, Dubrovka theater, where about 900 people were taken hostage and 115 people died because of gas being released. And then there was an incident of a school in the interiors of Russia, which was taken over by the Chechnya terrorists, and that was blown up. And again, hundreds of kids died. And according to Belton, in all these terrorist attacks, the one thing that she tries to make an assertion is that in none of them, they said that the terrorists did not have the ammunition. They didn't have real bombs. They were having fake bombs. But they were nevertheless sacrificed in order to show Putin as the real leader. And that also bolstered Putin's rating so that when he was up for second term in 2004, he was very easily re-elected. So that is again an assertion she makes, but she has been unable to prove. There are a lot of insinuations. However, I didn't see any proof in the book, but at least that's what she talks about. She also talks about in this part as soon as Putin became the president, one of the first things that he did was to privatize the broadcasting companies. So there were two broadcasting oligarchs, Boris Berezovsky and Vladimir Gusinski, and they were stripped of their empires, and they both of them fled the country. And then the biggest turning point was that the trial of Mikhail Khodorkovsky. And at that time, he was Russia's richest man with a controlling stake in Yukos, a big oil producer. And he was sentenced to 10 years of prison in 2005. And one of the key things that Belton brings about in the book through series of interviews and documents how the entire judicial proceeding was controlled and managed by one Mr. Igor Sechin, who was Putin's right-hand man. He was a senior KGB or FCB general. And he is the one how they manipulated the uh, judges. The judges were kept in an isolated location. Then the judges, they were forcibly given. The husband of one of the judges got a new car. He was made to buy the new car, and everybody knew. So they were put under a lot of machinations were done to ensure that the judges become complicit of the regime. And in fact, the final Belton asserts that the final the sentence that was given to Khodorkovsky for 10-year imprisonment was written by Igor Sechin and given to the judges to deliver. So, and why were they doing it? The reason behind them is that the KGB men, all these oligarchs that had come up during the Yeltsin era, they were all part of the KGB coterie. They were all, you will see all the oligarchs were part of KGB at one point of time in their early lives. And from there, they got the riches, and the KGB supported them at that time. However, as they became stronger under Yeltsin, they forgot about their KGB mentors, and they did not care about them. And that was also one thing that the KGB was finding, that the oligarchs were supposed to serve them, to help them in managing their aspirations. However, that did not happen. And so one of the first things that the KGB wanted to do as soon as Putin became the president was to take down these oligarchs and bring them under control. And that was the most important turning point, because with Khodorkovsky's trial and imprisonment, the rest of the oligarchs saw the writing on the wall and fell in line one by one. Putin has since presided over the country and its resources like a Tsar, bolstered by a cadre of friendly oligarchs and secret service agents. Putin allowed and even encouraged the oligarchs to accrue vast personal fortunes, but they were also expected to siphon some money from their business ventures into the Obshchak, which is the slush fund, for projecting the image of a powerful Russia on the world stage. According to former associates of Roman Abramovich, Putin personally directed the tycoon in 2003 to buy the Chelsea Football Club. Now, a claim that Roman denies, but however, this is what Belton talks to few people, and that's what comes out. And another source, Sergei Pugachev, that I talked about, who a one-time government Yeltsin family insider, who was instrumental in selecting Putin as and succeeding Yeltsin, and now an oligarch in exile in London, said that Putin's objective was to raise Russia's profile with the elite and the ordinary British people. The acquisition was part of a bigger infiltration of the West by Moscow via dirty cash. It was as if a virus is being planted in the Western region by Russia. However, the pivotal political event for Putin took place in 2005 when a pro-Western president, Viktor Yushchenko, came to power in Ukraine after the Orange Revolution, if you guys remember. The Russian president blamed the events on American money and the CIA without having any proof. It was the worst nightmare of Putin's KGB men that, inspired by the events in neighboring countries, Russian oppositionists funded by West would seek to topple Putin's regime too. This was the dark paranoia that colored and drove many of the actions Putin and his cronies were to take from there on. Coincidentally, this scenario, pro-Western democracy protesters overthrowing a corrupt and unpopular regime, was precisely the one that Putin had lived through in Dresden in 1989. You can see the relationship between the Ukrainian uprising and the the Berlin Wall fall. Putin was so upset by the events in Kiev that he even considered resigning. However, he was persuaded to stay on and fight back using the methods he knew, using the gas supply into Ukraine as a bargaining chip and corrupting Yushchenko, the president. And he was also, by the way, Yushchenko was also poisoned. If he claims that he was also poisoned later on when he turned against Putin. The pro-Russian separatists who would later launch a war in Eastern Europe in 2014 got their start around 2005. Russian propaganda deliberately sought to divide Ukraine and polarize its citizens, while Russian corruption reached deep into the economy of Ukraine. And that's what the KGB did, was to infiltrate every aspect of Ukraine's government and economy and corrupt so that they can divide the country. And this, after, in 2014, it led to the mass violence, and the Russian people in Ukraine, especially in Crimea, they were being armed, being given money, and that's how they rose up. And in 2014, that war happened, and that war is actually continuing even now. It is still sporadic violence is going on. So, in the year that Putin has been president, his KGB cronies have launched a series of major operations. There is a Deutsche Bank mirror trading scheme, the Moldovan laundromat scheme, the Danske Bank scandal, all of which used Western banks to help move stolen money out of Russia. And according to Belton, such schemes keep on coming out through the book to even present day, that they are happening. As much as West has been the target of Kremlin's active measures, Belton also says that the West has also been complacent and even complicit. The complacency has taken the form of a belief in the power of globalization and liberal democracy, a persistent faith that once Russia opened up to international capital and ideas, it would never look back. However, according to Belton, there were more mercenary motives at play. The Western business interests recognized how much profit could be made off Russian oil behemoths and the giant sum of money sloshing around in Russia. Even when Putin was the beneficiary of such arrangements, he looked upon, when he saw that you could buy off the Western governments, the Western businessmen by money. As long as they got paid, as long as the Western businesses got business, they didn't care about ideology. They didn't care about, and that made Putin very contemptuous of the Western thought processes. And he made a comment that anyone in the West could be bought. That was his comment. And nowhere it is more evident than in London. The British political and professional class has shown itself to be exceptionally greedy. Lords and peers have got jobs on the boards of Moscow state corporations, while the London Stock Exchange has allowed the flotation of many of these dodgy firms. The New York Stock Exchange, by contrast, has very stricter rules, and no such firms have listed over there. The Kremlin barons have bought up Kensington Palace, as you are aware, in London. Large sums from Russian emigrants have flown into Boris Johnson's Conservative Party, including right before the last election. Although the American electorate woke up to the reality of Russian influence operations only in 2016 with the Donald Trump scenario, the Russian KGB especially have been working to create this influence for a long time. They have been very much operative in Europe, and with the help of these front companies and a lot of friendly people in the government and in these countries, they have, and with the assistance of obviously social media, online disinformation campaigns, they promoted a whole network of think tanks and fake experts. Sometimes they aided existing political parties, the National Front in France, the Northern League in Italy, and sometimes they helped create new parties such as the far-right party Alternative for Germany. The most important funder of the British Brexit campaign have Russian contacts. So did some cabinet minister in Poland's supposedly anti-Russian hard-right government, elected after a campaign marked by online disinformation in 2015. So all these Russian-backed groups, from far-right Dutch politicians to the Brexit campaigners, share a common dislike. What do they have? So what Russian KGB agents would do, they would look at who are the people who do not like European Union, who do not like NATO, who do not like the concept of the West and the democracy itself. And those are the ideological people that were tapped and converted. And this has been done, as the book claims, since a long time, even prior to the fall of the Berlin Wall. And she makes a very great sentence: instead of democracy, autocracy; instead of unity, division; instead of open societies, xenophobia. How do you create that? So that in the Western societies. So that was the whole goal of this whole process. Um, lot of people are, what do you say, surprised with this Donald Trump and the Russian, how did this happen? And this is very interesting. Belton brings out a lot of data, and the book ends with this Donald Trump chapter. Belton documents the activities of businessmen who have circled around Trump not since 2016, but for the last 30 years, bailing him out, buying apartments in his building for cash, offering him deals, always operating in the half light between the Russian security services and the mob, with both sides using the other to their benefit. Among them are Shalva Chingarinsky, a Georgian black marketeer who met Trump in Atlantic City in 1990. They are cultivating Trump from those days, 1990s. Felix Sater, a Russian with mob links whose company Bayrock served, among other things, as the intermediary for Trump buildings in Manhattan, Fort Lauderdale, and Phoenix. Then there is Alex Schneider, a Russian metals trader who developed the Trump Hotel in Toronto, and Dmitry Rybolovev, an oligarch who purchased Trump's Palm Beach mansion in 2008 for $95 million, more than double what Trump paid in 2004, just as the financial crisis hit Trump's companies in 2008. Belton documents how the network used high-end real estate deals to launder money while evading stricter banking regulations after 9/11. So in US, after 9/11, you couldn't bring money straight through banking system. But through real estate, any amount of money could be brought in without any questions. And she shows how the KGB used this route to plow a lot of money into the United States. Again, I would say, to be very clear, Belton is agnostic on whether Trump was a witting accomplice who was aware of how he was being used, because he was after money. He wanted money for his business. And whenever he was in a hole, he was looking for financiers. So, and the key thing that she says, she interviewed one of the former executives of Trump, and he said, Donald Trump does not do any due diligence. He just goes and does it. So he needed money. Somebody offered it. He took it. So while many of these stories have been written before, about Trump, etc., Belton puts them in a very larger context. The hard truth is that Trump was not an exceptional. Again, she points out very well that he was just another amoral Western businessman, one of the many whom the ex-KGB elite have been promoting and sponsoring around the world, with the hope that they might eventually be of some political or commercial use later on. Many of these bets did not pay off, but in 2016, Putin finally hit the jackpot. His operatives helped elect an American president with long-standing Russian links who would not only sow chaos, but systematically undermine American alliances, erode American influence, and even in the spring of 2020, render the American federal government dysfunctional, damaging the reputation of both the US and democracy all across the board. In the epilogue, that's the end of the book, Belton notes that in seeking to restore their country's significance, Putin's KGB cronies have repeated many of the mistakes that Soviet predecessors made at home. And she's trying to link how the change in ideology from late 1990, or I would say early 2000, from 2000 to today, how there has been a sea change in the ideology. Previously, it was all about ensuring that we control resources of the country. That was what 2000 was all about, up to late middle of 2015, I would say. And what she says is that post that, the regime has changed. And since 2012, when Putin came back again after the brief 4-year period when Medvedev was the prime minister, puppet prime minister, puppet president, there was a change. And the change is more that they have created KGB has created a calcified authoritarian political system in Russia. The economy is very corrupt. It is discouraging any innovation and entrepreneurship. Instead of experiencing the prosperity and political dynamism that still seemed possible in the 90s, Russia is once again impoverished and apathetic. But Putin and his people are thriving, and that was the most important goal all along. One of the key assertions that the book makes, that had Russia continued on the trajectory that they were in 1990s, they would have been having a economy of more than 5 trillion today, just because of the energy and the raw materials and they're a very resource-rich country. But the plundering that has taken place has completely eroded the financial credibility of this of current Russia, and that is where the questions mark that Belton finished the book with the question mark: where is the Russian state going? Is it going back in time to the pre-Bolshevik region where it is becoming more and more insulated, or is it becoming a force to reckon with and replace the Soviet Union with a larger Russia that is a force to reckon with in the world, especially against America? So that's the end of the book. I have left out a lot of stuff in the book, but I've tried to give you what I could in the 45 minutes. So thanks for your patience, and I look forward to any questions. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Vikram, for giving a very good overview with a lot of contours of what the book wants to suggest about the Putin and his KGB aided empire currently in control in Russia. And yeah, it is indeed a very voluminous book and contains a lot of anecdotes. You picked up some good anecdotes to substantiate what the author wants to say. And to that end, this is a very nice and very good account of a very vivid portrayal. In fact, as you very rightly said, this is not a biography of Putin. It is just giving a portrayal of the events that have shaped Russia's fate and the economy and its political order with managed democracy in the post 1998 era till today. That is what it is. Basically, it covers
Correct.
about 20 years only. But yes, in one chapter, she has talked about the 7-year or 8-year dark period that followed after the collapse of Soviet Union, and when Boris Yeltsin and company came to power, the actual plundering and looting of immense natural resources had taken place in that era. Now, if I give you, in fact, I'm giving my view. Between 94 to 98, you check the GDP figures of Soviet Union. I mean, Russia, not Soviet Union. Their GDP had fallen consecutively for 4 years. Never before it had happened. So, that $5 trillion economy, which she is talking about. Now, in fact, $5 trillion economy is a very magical word. Everybody is talking about 5 trillion. It seems to be a very lofty goal. Even we in India also talking about $5 trillion economy. coming back to this, I think Putin has managed to steady the ship of Russia, and he has managed to ensure that Russia exists as it is today. Well, this is my view, but let me tell you, has she not mentioned while talking about the greed of the London merchant bankers and London lords for facilitating the empire building and slosh money by the oligarchs of Russia? So is it not a quid pro quo between the Western interests and the Russia, and also about the Northern? So what's your view on that? And then I'll take other questions here. Please.
Correct.
Thank you.
Yeah, again, I think again it's a very complex thing. Again, it's all what we see is what we believe in, and that's what I used to believe also, that the oligarchs were the real plunderers. And I agree, they did a lot of plundering. As I said, companies worth $7 billion, $10 billion were bought for $150 million because
Correct.
the Russian state was broke, and Yeltsin allowed that plunder to take place. So that has happened, and that definitely that was the rise of the oligarchs. However, two things to remember. One is during the Boris Yeltsin era, the oil was very low, less than $11. I think at around 98, 99, the oil was only $11. Oil went up only
Yes.
after Putin came in power. So that's one thing that I did not cover. How the rise of oil has helped the Russian GDP growth. So the Russian GDP
Yeah.
growth is basically driven on the oil price. So that's one thing we have to remember. The second thing I would like to give you, again, it's a statistics, a number. During Boris Yeltsin's time, whatever be it may be, 70% of the companies were private companies. Only 30% were state organizations. After communism, where 100% were state companies, 70% were privatized for whatever reason. Whatever way they were done, that was a separate thing. But today, the reverse is there. Now, again, over 60% of the companies are state-owned in Russia. Most of the oligarchs' companies, by the way, have been taken over by the state. And if you, again, I have not gone into the details, but if you look at who is heading each of those companies, and Belton very clearly lays out how they are related to Putin. And most of these people are either all the heads of Rosneft, Yukos, Gazprom, all the heads of all these companies, they are all either Putin's colleagues from Dresden, or most of them from from St. Petersburg, when he was running the oil for food scheme. So all those people who were working with him at that time, they're all the heads of these state enterprises. So,
Yeah.
so
Yeah, can I just intervene with a piece of information here, Vikram? You see, uh, if the state of Russia was not controlling, those energy-rich companies, do you think that Russia would have been able to enter into a long-term contract with China, 30-year-old long contract for $880 billion worth of energy supply? And so far, to the best of my knowledge, there is no evidence to suggest that there is any money, ill-gotten money, being exchanged in that particular long-term deal, government to government contract for 30 years. Do you think that the oligarchs would have allowed this kind of a long-term interest-serving contract to happen between China and Russia?
okay, let me give you this piece of information. When Khodorkovsky was Khodorkovsky
Yeah.
was the most progressive of all oligarchs. In 2003, around 2003, he was in talks with BP. He was in talks with ExxonMobil
Yes.
for them to buy out a part of his company. He was also working to work with Roman Abramovich to combine their companies and create this oil behemoth and put it on the Western Stock Exchange. Now, this was a threat to Putin. When he found out about this, the book talks about the whole process. Why Khodorkovsky of all oligarchs? Why not somebody else? He found out that at first he supported that yes, you should do it because this would be a vehicle for Russia to get inroads into the financial system and the economy of the West. But then he found out that because of 50% or whatever percent that stake would be sold to Exxon and BP and all these companies, they
Yeah.
would bring in their managers, they would bring in their this thing. He said, no, this will not work.
Okay.
So that is one piece of
Okay.
information. Now, this is what the
Okay.
book talks about. Right or wrong, I don't know. I'm not an
Okay.
expert.
Okay. No, no, fine, fine, fine. Okay, now let's take the questions from the participants in this meeting. This one is from Chirag. Like Israel, where most of the prime ministers are ex-Mossad, it seems true now in Russia too. This is his
Correct.
observation. Yeah.
Correct. And I
Yeah.
will just
On
add
the
to this that when Yeltsin came to power, one of his first proposals was to get rid of all KGB men in the administration in his team. But it was shot down because most of the people were KGB people and they didn't agree to it. So he couldn't do anything about it. Just for
yeah.
your information.
Right. Chirag, in the same breath, says that most intelligence networks are like that, and he's saying that CIA is probably pioneer in that. I'm
Correct.
imagining, that's what he says. Yes, CIA is the fountainhead, of all such things. I mean, nobody can take the place of replace CIA in that
Yes.
aspect. Anyway, the next is from Tailab Shah. Unlike KGB, not many CIA officials are known to be enriching themselves. I guess. I think it is with a tongue-in-cheek remark, or we can take it on the face value. Vikram, how you want to take it?
I have no idea about this. So I have no
Yeah,
information to
so
substantiate.
I take it as a tongue-in-cheek remark, so that's fine. Anyway, this is Professor Surendra Sundarajan. I think he's endorsing Chirag. Your guess is right. They are past masters in assassination and overthrowing governments. You should read about Jacob and Petraeus and Salvador and Allende, another. Allende means, that Peruvian or. So he's
Correct.
referring to, number of them. So they have had a role in that. I don't know whether CIA or KGB or both. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Anyway, yeah. Okay. Any? You want to comment, Vikram?
no, I'm good. Yeah.
Okay, this one is from Pravir Chakrabarti. Watch Citizen K on Prime Video, and you will get a good flavor of how oligarchs were running the country. Semi-documentary, very well done. So he's recommending to watch this documentary.
Correct. And I will add to that, along with this, I watched this documentary. Along with that, watch another documentary on Netflix called as Icarus, Icarus. It is
Okay.
about the doping scandal
Oh.
in Sochi Olympics and how it is a state-sponsored doping scandal. It's worth watching. It will help you understand how
Yeah.
it is being done. So it's a 2-hour documentary, really worth watching.
Tailab Shah is again chipping in. Judges becoming, I think you made a mention that, the judges in Russia are all roped in and, are managed ones. He is saying judges becoming complicit with the regimen sounds quite familiar. This is his remark. I don't think he is talking in the context of what is happening in India today. I think he's talking in general. Is that right? Okay. Anyway, Arup Banerjee, good morning. Very good book on historical facts and excellent summarized review by friend Shri Vikram Singhal. Move from Mr. Boris to Mr. Putin along with many move from communalism to capitalism is noteworthy. Glimpses of KGB actions and their effect on finance and economy with port and energy assets are well documented. So this is complimentary remark. Then this one is from Chirag Bakshi, more conspicuous now in USA, where they are not only complicit, they are appointed only if they agree to be complicit.
Yes.
Very true. Yeah.
Correct.
Very. We should all be careful, Chirag again say, in commenting about Putin with this free and unlimited supply of poison. Anyway, yeah, Pravir is commenting power of money and social media. Then Sagar Mehta has this view. Today, Russia is second highest oil producer. there are a lot of underhand dealings with many neighboring countries, and it is this money with which Russia is playing its game. Yes, that's what the author also says.
Correct.
Then
So I just want to comment on this.
please, please.
One of the ways. Now again, this is all in the book. I don't have any knowledge of this, but this is what I learned from the book. That any gas contract that is done or oil contract that is done by Russia, the company like Gazprom or Yukos or Rosneft, they will never sell directly to the end user. There will always be a middleman. There's always a company in between, never directly. And these are the companies that, in Russia, the oil is sold at probably 1/4 the price that is out there in the international market locally. So these companies buy at that price and then they sell at the international. And that differential is what creates, according to this author, the slush fund.
Okay. Tailab sir, economists talk of widening gap between rich and poor with the combination of greed, power, the mighty politicians across the globe, across the globe. Is there a hope for bridging this gap? I would recommend you to read the latest paper written in 2017 by Thomas Piketty on inequality spreading in Russia also. That gives a very good account of that. But anyway, Vikram, you have anything to say? You can check in.
Yeah, I would say that
Chirag is inspired. Please go ahead.
Okay.
No, that's okay.
No, I would just add to that the first part of Putin's 8 years, the first 8 years, and let's say Medvedev 4 years, were good years for Putin because during that period, oil was going up. And what had happened during the Yeltsin era, people were totally impoverished. So when Putin came in, as you rightly mentioned, he brought in a lot of stability.
Yes.
He brought in a lot of, because he was able to control everything, unlike Yeltsin, who was not controlling anything. He was able to control all of people's living standards started to improve. And they kept on improving as the oil price kept on increasing. And it is only since, I would say, the last 4-5 years that the living standards in Russia have started to deteriorate. They have started to come down because the oil prices have gone down. And what has happened, one more thing that the book talks about, the corruption has started to hit the local people. What has happened is previously each region in Russia used to have their own governors, and these governors would be elected by the local population. They would be local people. But now, I think about 10 years ago or 2012, when Putin came in, at that time, the governors were changed, the process was changed, and all governors are picked by Moscow. Handpicked, they are appointed. And so that has also disenchanted a lot of these far-flung regions. And I think in the newspapers you can read nowadays, there are some, murmurs of discontent happening, especially in the Far East. So these are the kind of issues that are plaguing Russia today.
Okay, Vikram, can I chip in with this? In which country, taking particular example of India, all the public sector banks and public sector undertakings, are they not handpicked?
Obviously they are.
So that's what. So Russia is not.
No, but this is the governor of the state, like the chief minister.
Yeah. So who is appointing the governors in India today?
Yeah, but there's still an election and all that. So in US,
not for the governors.
There is no election.
Governors are not appointed by. They are appointed by the government. Anyway, that's okay. That's something.
Yeah, but the governors are different. Yeah, like they are like our chief minister in Russia. So
yeah. Okay. Sagar asked a question. Does the book talk about oil politics in US and Middle East? Does the book have any reference? That's what he meant.
No, it is all from a Russian perspective.
Okay. Then next question from Ashok Luktuke. Putin has been successful in managing politics and elections in other countries, but has been subject to Western trade embargo, and Russia has not been able to stabilize economically. The ruble, I think he's talking about. The ruble is the currency, is one of the lowest valued currency in the world today. I
Yeah.
agree with the observation. Yeah, you can if you want.
Yeah, I'll just like to comment because the book does talk about this. See, all these embargoes and all these sanctions that were put on specific individuals and companies in Russia. In fact, the book talks how at first they were looked upon with fear, but subsequently, I think the Putin and his team, they have started to look at it as a challenge, and they have started to uh, take actions in order to work and impose their will in spite of these sanctions. So they have found out a lot of workaround mechanisms to get past these sanctions. So the sanctions have, I would say, have failed because they have, in fact, double the resolve that whatever they are doing, they have to continue to do it, but now they will do it in a different way.
Yeah. Okay. Dr. Rumin Shah is asking, any mention of Kasparov and his opposition of Putin in the book? Kasparov.
No, nothing about Kasparov. He is
Nothing.
too lowly, too small a fry to be talked about.
Right now, the attention is on Alexei Navalny.
Yes, Navalny.
Navalny. Shashi is complimenting you and acknowledging that this book can only be read in a forum. It cannot be reviewed, but you have done a fantastic job presenting in a very abridged version. Well done.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Chirag, of course, he has a lot of questions. I think Chirag is going to buy a book, at the end of this. What about Putin managing to stay and become a lifetime president? It's a good question, which is who supported? I think self-supported, if not anything else. Anyway, yeah, I think Vikram, anything on that? I think there is a move to change the constitution of Russia, whereby, that 2 consecutive terms limitation will not apply to Vladimir Putin. That's on the move after he became he got elected in 2018, I think. Anyway, Vikram, you have any latest update on that? You can give the update.
Yeah, correct. I think Russia went through a election in or a referendum sort of in June, I think.
Yes.
And in June, there were 5 questions posed. One question was related to should there be an increase in what do you call the
tenure.
That was one of the questions.
Yeah, tenure.
But there were other key questions about, I think, pension, improving standards or whatever. And 5th question was the increase of the tenure of the president for life. And for all the 5 questions, you could answer only one yes or no.
So why was can I tell you why the 5th question was put the last?
Yes.
It was to be inferred by the people that if you want any of the 4 things as mentioned above, you got to say yes to the 5th one. That's
correct.
That was the logic.
So I think in that 70% people said yes. So I think that is coming through very shortly.
I think so. Yeah, that's right. See, we still have time, so another 5-10 minutes, we'll keep taking questions because this kind of books, are more discussed through interactive question answers, So anyway, Sagar is asking, does the book talk about equation Russia, China against the USA, Western Europe plus Saudi? I don't think so, but anyway, I don't think that's because this is a portrayal of KGB and Putin. Tailap is again coming with a question. It is said that Putin aspires to regain superpower status for Russia. However, with the state of affairs as described in the book, one doubts whether that is going to be possible. I think with all nationalist leaders of current era, becoming superpower and becoming great again seems to be the flavor, isn't it? And I don't think Putin is an exception, whether it is China, India, Russia, everybody. Good. Everybody's complimenting, a lot of complimentary messages. Incidentally, in today's newspaper, it has been reported that Russia is now second after USA in oil production.
Correct.
I think that's correct. I think that's correct information.
Yes.
This is from Dr. Anil Gupta. Excellent review and superb introductory remark. Blah blah blah. I have immensely enjoyed the review. Good.
Thank you.
This is from Arup Banerjee. Synopsis review of Sri Vikram and other panelists has enriched my knowledge. Thank you. Thank you for staying tuned in, to Baroda Book Browsers meetings. Keep doing that in future. It will keep on encouraging us. Excellent, excellent. This one seems to be a question. Dhananjay More. Today, Russia is trying to reclaim its second spot in the world by launching Sputnik 5 vaccine for COVID-19, just like in the space race. Yes,
Yeah.
Russia is making a good headway in offering the vaccine to the world against this current COVID-19 pandemic. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think it is.
Yeah, please go ahead.
I like to just add, because this is a great point, because why is Russia doing this? Why are they rushing through the trials? They have not even finished. They have not even done the safety assessment of this vaccine, but yet they are trying to launch it. I think it is, as I said, that the focus of this regime is to showcase Russian superiority, is to showcase that Russia is number one, and they have the the assertion that they're doing in Syria, the role that they're playing in Libya and other places, and Venezuela. I don't know how many of you are aware. Russia has spent almost $5 billion in the Syrian war.
Yes.
Russia has spent $20 billion in supporting Venezuela against the world. So Russia is putting in a lot of money in a lot of these areas just to ensure that they take the crown of the superpower from US, because the US has retracted. Somebody has to fill that space, and that's what Russia is doing today.
Well, a slightly differing view on this, because see, if you look at the involvement of Russia in all of those countries that you mentioned, include Venezuela, is essentially to protect their strategic geopolitical interest. And look at if they don't involve themselves and protect the regimes in Syria and Venezuela, the Western powers would manage to topple that regime and have some other regime in place. So it's a part of the larger geopolitical scheme of things. But let me tell you, one of the reasons why Russia became economically weak in 70s and 80s was that in order to keep pace with the USA militarily, it had to spend so much of funds out of its GDP towards military upkeep and military update, that it was not able to handle its economy well. And in fact, that was partly the reason why a lot of problems arose on economic front in Russia, and eventually, I mean, in Soviet Union former, and it eventually led to its fallout, or its collapse. This one, Surendra Rajan is giving a little bit of pick into the history after complimenting. Russia has suffered, or Soviet Union has suffered during invasions from the West by Napoleon, later Hitler. A detail that the West won't mention is an intrusion by British and American troops in 1917 or thereabouts. Absolutely agree. In fact, if you look at the history, Russia has also a lot of things to talk about, the role played by the Western powers.
So let me add
me.
one thing, one bit of data on this. When I think Surendra has brought out a very important point. When why is Russia behaving the way they are today, and why is there a friction with the West? When the Soviet Union broke up, and then the republics in Eastern Europe became independent, one of the assurances given by Europe and America to Russia, Soviet Union, or Gorbachev at that time, was that we will not convert them into EU, the bloc, and we will not bring them into the NATO fold. However, what happened? Within a few years, most of these countries are part of NATO. And this was something that Russians, especially Putin, they said that this is not, the West is not honoring their promise and they are
Yes,
threatening us. And that
yes,
also is a big reason behind this Russian ideology and pushback
absolutely.
against the West.
Absolutely, it's a part of the larger geopolitical, scheme of things. Uh, Hitesh Gala is giving a suggestion that can the reviewers upload PDF of the book which they review. Let me tell you, as far
No.
as the virtual meetings are concerned, the recorded version is always available to view on YouTube under the name Baroda Book Browser. As far as the presentation is concerned, in fact, Vikram has not made any presentation while reviewing the books. But others who are reviewing the book, my request is that you please write a two-mail complimentary mail to the respective reviewers and request them, and if they can share the presentation, they would gladly do that. I think that's more important. Ajay Parikh, your friend, is complimenting and. Engineering has been an enlightening morning. Thank you. That's what he said. And this is the last one. Again, a compliment. Listening to Vikram is always enriching knowledge. Thanks for the wonderful review. So, with this concluding, feedbacks from the participants, let me take once again an opportunity to thank Vikram for conducting a very, very comprehensive, very competent review of a book which is difficult. It's required more to be read and absorbed and then understood. But still, all the contours and all the major aspects of the portrayal of the Putin and his KGB man as they are in charge of Russia, which the author has put in the book in very voluminous form with a lot of anecdotes. Catherine has done that job. You have done that job in 45, 50 minutes. Wonderful. Mid morning, we have all spent while attending this virtual meeting. Keep attending, keep taking care of yourself in this ongoing corona pandemic. On that note, I conclude and declare this meeting of Baroda Book Browser as adjourned until we meet next month in September. Goodbye and have a nice Sunday. Thank you, one and all.
Thank you very much. Good day to you guys.
Thank you.